As I remember, the cast was just a dream for the most part. It's like most of them was their first feature, and they were as committed and devoted to trying everything. They were like old troopers. They were afraid of nothing. They would do anything. It was one of those great cast experiences.
The first time that I met Brian was in a casting session, and he and George Lucas were sharing a casting session, and Brian was looking for people for Carrie, and George was looking for people for Luke Skywalker, which is what I ended up auditioning for in that session. And I think they were sitting there going, oh, I like him, and I want him, I want to make sure I call him back, and ultimately I didn't get Luke Skywalker, but I got Tommy.
George and I were both looking for unknowns, so we sat together and basically went through hundreds of boys and girls looking for the cast for Carrie and Star Wars.
I had never made a film before, and I was doing a production of Romeo and Juliet on the stage when this audition came up for Star Wars. And everybody in town was going in on this. And Brian De Palma was sitting in the corner of all the interviews that George was giving. And he was kind of like making his little mental notes to say, okay, George can only pick so many, I'll see what's left. And that's how I ended up working my first film.
I came out to LA, and it was just a magical thing that one of the first auditions I went on was this dual audition that George Lucas and Brian De Palma had. I just remember right away Brian looking at me, and I could just sort of tell that he liked me. And then George Lucas was just kind of stern-faced, and Brian turned to him and said, I'll put this one on my list.
My career at the time of Carrie was like, what career? I didn't really have a career at that time. I was just starting in films. I had been working in New York, doing commercials and studying acting. So I had the movie bug, and I decided to come out to Los Angeles, and nothing was happening, and I didn't really have many interviews. And so by November, I was fed up. I said, that's it. This is the movie business. This is for me. I'm going back to New York. And I was coming out of the steam room at the gym, and I heard this woman's voice, Nancy? Is that Nancy? And I turned around, and it was casting director. She said, oh, I'm casting this movie, and I can't believe I haven't seen you. I've been casting for 3 months. It's the last day, and you probably won't get the part, but it's a really good script, and at least you'll get to meet a director. And I said, okay. So I went and picked up the script and read the script, and I was the last person, the last day, to read for Carrie.
I went on an audition for Phantom of the Paradise, and I had a lot of attitude back then. And De Palma was kind of intrigued by that. And so he kind of took an interest in me, and he didn't cast me in Phantom, but he called me in to loop minor characters in the Phantom of the Paradise. And then he had me do several minor characters in Obsession as well. And months went by, and he called me one day, and he said he'd like to take me to dinner. And he gave me the book, Carrie. He said, this is going to be my next movie, and I want you to play the part of the gym teacher. So I read the book, and it was this teeny part. And then a few months later, they sent me the script, and he had actually incorporated the part of the principal with the gym teacher, so that it was a fabulous part. It was a wonderful debut part in a movie. After that, he had me loop the little boy on the bicycle that, rides through this creepy Carrie. And he made me do it over and over and over again, and he would just be back in the control room dying laughing. I don't recall him telling me that it was Cameron De Palma, his nephew.
Sissy and I met on a film called Badlands, Terry Malick directed, and that was in 1972 out in Colorado. Later, after Badlands, the first De Palma film I did was Phantom of the Paradise, and I was working as a production designer. When that film was over, he asked me to work on Carrie. My wife, Sissy, who worked as a set dresser, decorator on Phantom, helping me out in a pinch because we had no money or any crew, read the book, Carrie, and wanted to try out for the part.
Sissy had done a couple of films, but I had my eye set for a young actress I had seen in a movie where she has to get an abortion, and she was very touching and moving, and I thought this girl was going to get the part.
Brian was meeting with everyone, and he would meet us in big groups, and he'd have one person read Carrie, and then, he'd mix it all up. So I was feeling a little weird because I was only testing for one. So I didn't have as big a shot as everybody else did of getting in the film. So I got this commercial, and it just happened to be on the same day as the test, and I thought, I'll call Brian and see what I can do.
I said, Sissy, I think you should take the commercial because I got my eye on this girl. I think she's going to be something.
I think I said some expletive and hung up the phone. It just made me so mad. I reread the book the day before the screen test, and I think I rubbed Vaseline in my hair, and I found some old sailor suit that my mother had made for me in 7th grade, and I took the hem out of it, and I was really into it, and I was feeling very sorry for myself, which was perfect for the character. So when I went into the test the next morning, I don't think I even washed my face. They had hair and makeup there, and they saw me come in, and they just ran for me because I would just look so awful, and of course I was, no. I think that I felt so used and abused at that point because I knew Brian, I was not his favorite. And that worked for me. I just decided I was going to get it.
She came in and did the test and, of course, blew everybody away.
Because I was working on the film's production designer, the next day I went to see the results of all the tests. And the girl that Brian had wanted came on and did her rendition of Carrie, and then Sissy came on and just like knocked people's socks off. It was so great. Well, Sissy was waiting for me out in the parking lot of the car because she was anxious to see how it went.
And he came running out and said, "Hey, you got the part. Ask for whatever you want." Which was very little, I might add.
The idea of Piper came from Marcia Nassiter, who was an executive at United Artists at the time. And I'd always been an admirer of Piper Laurie. And I thought, this is an interesting idea.
I'd done The Hustler, and I retired for 15 years until I was asked to do Carrie. I no longer had an agent, but a wonderful woman who had been my agent years before in New York City called and said, "I have a script here. I'm going to set it up and read it." So I did, and I thought it was sort of a cliche part, and I didn't get it. And I was talking to my husband that evening, and I said, "No." He said, "Well, you know, Brian De Palma has a comedic approach to just about everything he does." And I thought, oh, that's the secret. I didn't read it properly. So I reread it, and I thought, oh, this is a satire. And so I took the train into New York City, and I met Brian De Palma, and he was so charming, and he didn't make me feel as if I were being interviewed or interrogated. He told me a lot about himself, and we said goodbye, and I took the train back to Woodstock and got a message that they wanted me to do the movie.
The reason my mother, Priscilla Pointer, plays my mother in Carrie was Brian's idea. He had done that in, I believe it was Sisters. Maybe it was Jennifer Salt's mother played her mother, and he really liked that dynamic of the truth right there.
As far as hearing about the project of Carrie, Amy was cast as Sue Snell. And because Brian had already had a history of using a mother and daughter together in films, he asked if I would read for it, and I did, and because it was the part of Amy's mother, I played it extremely well.
I think we got the best group of actors that were around at the time, and they connected with the audience, and many of them went on to have long careers.
After the movie was all cast, we spent a week together, the cast. And we held a class election, and we kind of played these kind of theater games to sort of, within the character, to kind of connect us all.
And I remember I was doing this parts over and over again, pairing them up, switching them around, trying improvisations. I mean, and everybody, of course, was very eager to try anything I could dream of, basically.
And then when we finally got to the actual stage and we began to shoot, there was no discussion about character and why you're doing this or that. He felt that he had already done his work with the actors, and now he was concerned with the camera.
All the actresses knew that they were going to have to be naked or partially naked, which created a tremendous amount of tension in the cast. They had all kinds of anxieties about doing it, and a few of the actresses finally balked and said, "I can't do this," were crying, and fortunately, some of them were troopers and played it completely naked, and you see some with clothes on and some partially dressed, and that's how we arrived at that slow motion opening shot.
In a way, It worked out really well because we all bonded in that scene. We all bonded through our fear and all the stuff that was going on. And I remember we did talk about some smoke and fog and maybe an arm here and a leg there, but it was kind of full everything, which I didn't mind. I thought it was very beautiful, so I couldn't really be too upset about it.
I knew I was already at my locker, so I felt a little safer, and I wasn't as terrified as everyone else, but I think what came out of it is so beautiful. To be in a horror film with such eroticism and beauty and grace, it's a unique thing.
Fortunately, Sissy had to do all this sort of naked soaping of her body before any of the girls got into the shower. And at that point, I was allowing the kids to see the rushes, so they thought, oh my God, I mean, Sissy can do this, we can do this.
That shower scene, of course, I worried about that and wanted it to work, wanted it to be authentic, wanted to be able to lose myself in it and not think about being naked in front of the world. I went to Brian and I said, Brian, I'm so worried about this scene. What's it like? And he thought for a minute. Well, Sissy, it's like getting hit by a Mack truck. I said, like a Mack truck? He said, it's like getting hit by a Mack truck. He obviously wanted shock. And I went to Jack, who we had decided would be in the shower with me, putting the blood in my hand because that was going to be out of frame. And then I bring it up to see it. And I said, Jack, he said it would be like getting hit by a Mack truck. What's getting hit by a Mack truck like?
Sissy didn't quite know how to make sense of it. But I, as a kid, had been run over by a car. So I started telling her what it was like to be hit by a car. And she was able to use that. You know, Brian's suggestion and my sort of visualization from having been through it to become Carrie's reaction to finding blood coming out of her body. And between every take, I would tell her the story of how I was hit by a car. And, you know, it was at Christmas time. I was looking around at Christmas lights and everything was happiness. And then I saw a car coming and then it was veering away and then suddenly it hit me and then I was like trapped underneath and couldn't get out.
When I'm playing that scene, I am walking down a road looking at the Christmas lights. And when I see the blood in my hand, it's when he looks over and sees the car. That's what I was thinking. That's what was going on in my mind during the shower scene.
We got to the point where she comes out of the shower for the first time, and I said, well, maybe I'll try to do this like cinema verite. I'll just try to follow Sissy as she comes out and see what the girls do.
To shoot it, I have to say, was maybe the most disturbing thing that I've ever shot because it's like a gang, it's like a tribe and a ritual or some kind of horrible thing. And we did work ourselves into this sort of frenzied state. And I did start to feel like I hated her and all of those feelings that you're supposed to be feeling as a character, but I remember shaking. It was very disturbing, very, very disturbing.
It's all over the top. But Piper was so amazing because she just came in and just filled up that character with such power, and it was mind-boggling. She just like inflated that role. So it was such fun to do battle with her, with that power, you know, to meet that power. No matter what we gave each other, the other, you know, it was a dance.
You know, when you're acting, your adrenaline is so high, you don't feel a lot of things. Of course, Sissy is so slender and light. That was nothing. I don't think she got too bruised.
When she's dragging her into the closet, it made me think of Helen Keller, you know, with Patty Duke. So that inspired me in that role, her just kicking and screaming and just being like a child at that point. And that was what was in my mind in that scene.
You have to thank the actresses for pulling this off. They're playing, you know, the miserable little tortured, abused child of the religious nutcase. And the fact that both these actresses brought a tremendous amount of reality and humanity to these characters, plus they were almost comic, but at the same time quite real. Very difficult to do and make believable so the whole thing doesn't sort of fall apart from the artifice of it.
We were all approximately the same age, too. Everybody was either in their early 20s to mid-20s, and I think I was 26, and I might have been the oldest in that context, but it was odd because while I was a peer with everybody in terms of age, I played this authority figure.
Betty Buckley and I used to commute to Redondo Beach together. She and I got to know each other pretty well during that time, and there's a sequence in which she's really disappointed in us because we've been throwing Tampax at Carrie while she's having her period, and she was bawling us out in the gym, and it came to a shot of me, and Brian really wanted me to be the most guilty of all, and he wanted me to well up. He wanted tears to well up. Well, he didn't know, since he'd never worked with me before, that all he had to say was, I'd like you to well up on this. So instead, he tried to manipulate it from me, and he had Betty Buckley behind the camera hurling abuses at me. And having been very intimate with her on all the car rides down, she knew so much about me. Literally, I'm not reacting to being berated about the Tampax. I'm literally like, Betty's saying these awful things to me. And so that was a little moment where I was out of character.
She thinks she's so tough, and I'm tougher. And Brian wants me to grab her and slap her, you know. And I'm like, okay, well, let's do like a phony, stage slap. And he goes, no, I want you to really slap her.
Betty slapped me, I think about 30 times we did that scene. And Brian said, do it again. And he said, Betty, hit her harder. But it was awful. John was very much a wonderful collaborator, very supportive, great sense of humor, and a wonderful, wonderful actor, great improviser. You could really do anything, and you never knew what he was going to do either. The car scene with John Travolta, we shot really over a period of days. It looks like a short scene, but it's not, because we shot all night doing the cruising back and forth and passing the cars and all of that, and him throwing the beer, and the entire floor of the car was just covered in beer. It just smelled. It was horrible. John, unlike Betty, really wouldn't hit me. He was so afraid of hurting me that he was very, very gentle with me. So we just played with it. But the funny thing is that whenever John and I worked together on the movie, we just thought we were very funny. I had no idea we were such villains until I saw the movie. We were like the comic relief on the set,
The way it looked when I saw it on film was strange. It was more than just that. It almost was like there was a transformation. Brian it was interesting, he put us at the ends of a long, narrow table. And I think in the back, I may be imagining this, but wasn't it the Last Supper? There were so many symbolic things from his Catholic past. He had everything so thought out that all we had to do was just work within the boundaries that he had set up for us, but we had freedom within those boundaries.
I take pride in rescuing one of my favorite lines. It's very subtle and it sort of goes by. People don't pay any attention to it, really. But it's in that scene when I come to see her just before she's getting ready to go, and she's made her own dress. And obviously it's pale pink, which wasn't planned. It was in the script. My line is red. I might have known it would be red. And the designer decided that pink would look nicer on Sissy. And no one bothered to check the dialogue. And so there I was with my line, red. I might have known it would be red. Brian was going to change it. And I said, no. In her head, it's red.
I remember having Piper on the set, and I would look into those eyes, and I'd think, what is this woman thinking? I don't have a clue. And then she would do this, and I'd be, amazed every time. I didn't have a clue what was going on in her brain. I knew she had a kind of very odd sense of humor, but she created this person that was just like, oh my God, and funny and real and passionate and violent and quite unusual.
Much of that dialogue was Stephen King. I can see your dirty pillows, all that stuff. It's given me such pleasure through the years. People get such a kick out of it.
The prom scene is, of course, that is the moment. You know, that's what the whole movie leads up to. And you have everybody there, all your key players, and everybody with their own agenda.
As I recall, they set up a dolly track, a circular dolly track. And they put the camera on that, and the crew was going one way, and Sissy and I were going another way and trying to orchestrate dialogue every time the camera passed either me or Sissy. I would speak as it was crossing me, and she would speak it was crossing her.
We always had the feeling of the prom and the romance and the music and the swept away, and it was exhilarating and romantic and magical.
It's the paradise moment for Carrie. I mean, everything is sort of just perfect, and it's the last moment of pure ecstatic beauty until the fall begins.
Brian storyboards everything, and I do remember him showing me exactly what was going to happen in that sequence. It was very well planned out, very well rehearsed, and there were no accidents. I mean, it was all in his head.
Pulling the rope, for me, as I recall, it's supposed to be some sort of very almost orgasmic kind of a thing. And, you know, Brian certainly was tuned into that. And I just remember it being a release of almost like an orgasm in a funny kind of a way.
I remember doing that scene with the blood and trying to imagine what it would be like and trying not to react to knowing it was about to happen. The blood was made from Karo syrup and food coloring, red food coloring. And they warmed it, so it felt like a heavy, warm blanket. It was an amazing sensation. But after it started to dry, it got sticky. And so my chin would stick to my neck and my arms would stick to my sides. And to get my dress off after we shot all day, I'd have to just get into a shower. If I sat down, I would stick to a chair. They had someone with me with a little spritz bottle, unsticking me. I think we did it a few times, but not many, maybe 2 or 3, because I had to get completely redone. I stayed off to myself the whole time. It was very lonely. So every day I would come in, they would do everything, and then they'd put this stuff on me. So it was quite an ordeal. It's a very humbling experience.
This bucket was falling from quite a ways up, although I must give them credit. They did let me feel, and I did know that it was kind of this cardboard substance that was going to hit me.
Sissy, once she got that blood on, she went into some kind of Zen trance that was difficult for me to recreate or understand how she did it. She just did this thing that was so terrifying.
Brian would say, "Open your eyes wider." You know, he knew exactly what he wanted me to do. It was very effective. I so benefited from Jack being the production designer because he had huge amounts of research that I was able to study for body language. I'd see how I wanted to end up in a scene, the position that I wanted to be in, because it was just much more dramatic.
There was a stunt girl for me for actually going against the stage and falling down, but he wanted a close-up of my face, and it kind of was supposed to just hit my cheek like this, but instead the force of the water was so strong, and it was such a wide stream of water that instead it went into my ear, and it broke my eardrum instantly, and it was excruciating. It was unbelievable.
All the people in the die are basically involved in this Greek tragedy of torment. So they're all guilty, and they all have to go.
In the book, Miss Collins lives at the end and is one of the survivors along with Sue Snell, so I was quite hopeful that Brian would have Miss Collins live. I didn't know until right towards the end of the film that my character was going to be killed. Nobody knew how the movie was going to end. And I really thought and campaigned to Brian that Miss Collins should live. And then when I found out I was going to die at the prom, I was like, damn, you know. Then I was really curious about how I'm going to die. And so this basketball backboard thing was really fascinating. And it would come down like a guillotine. And then there was about a foot of balsa wood. And so it was meant to appear that it, you know, cut Miss Collins in half. Then they put the stunt woman in, and she's going to take the hit, but they don't know because they've never tried it, how it's going to work, right? So they put the stunt lady in, and we're all watching, and sure enough, it hit. And the balsa did everything it was supposed to. It broke nicely and stopped right at her midsection the way it was supposed to. So then we put me back in the shot after the stunt girl took the blow, and Brian's directions to me were classic. He comes up to me and he goes, "I want you to squirm like a bug on a pin."
I think one of the most dangerous things, one of the most frightening things was when the car flips. I'm in the front of the shot. That was as scared as I've ever been. I wasn't in any danger, but, you know, you're so worried that you're going to do something and screw up something that some stuntman is risking their life to do. And so that was very upsetting.
We were just in the car, and we were screaming, and then it was done optically to make it look like the car was spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. It was very exciting to shoot that sequence and to watch the stunt person. It was actually Dick Zeiker who did the explosion in the car.
One of the scenes I loved the most was when Piper stabs me. It's like I finally have my mother's holding me, and it's just so wonderful. I'm just in heaven, and she stabs me in the back.
I chose to think that this was the most glorious, wonderful thing that could happen to my child, like graduating high school. My elaborate death took a whole day. The interesting part was when I got wounded in places on my body, and there was a steel girdle made for my chest area, and on it were wooden blocks in the strategic spots where I was going to be wounded. There was a wire attached to the wood, and it would come out through a hole in my gown, and it would go across the room to where the special effects man was standing, and he would put on the scissors or the potato peeler or whatever, and very slowly this thing would just jiggle along on the wire until it finally met me. In the script, Margaret gets impaled with all of these things and reacts normally, and I remember I wanted something fresh, and I said, "Oh, Brian, you know, it would be interesting if maybe when she's dying, that it's great, that she loves it." He said, "Oh, terrific, yeah, do that." It was Margaret's triumph. It was ecstasy because she was going to be where she wanted to be.
There were a lot of times that they wanted to shoot my feet going upstairs. They wanted to shoot my hands, and they wanted to send me home and use a stand-in, and I was adamant about doing all my own foot and hand work. So they dug a hole, and then they put plywood on it. I got in the hole, and then they had a hole cut with pumice rock, so it was just really pretty awful when I brought my arm up.
Amy came up with the flowers and put them down, and at the right moment, I hollered to Sissy to grab, and she got her hands up through the charcoal and stuff to grab Amy.
It was hard for Mom, I think, because that last moment, I don't think she'd ever seen me hysterical. Brian was able to tap into the whole mother-daughter dynamic of that moment with the truth flowing.
She was so emotionally wrought up that I was holding on to her and saying all the lines and so forth. And at one time I was sure that I said Amy instead of Sue. And I was so worried about this that I remember on the screening of the film I was listening, particularly for that. And of course, you couldn't hear it. You couldn't hear a thing. It wasn't just the music which swelled, but the audience was just screaming, screaming, screaming for about 10 minutes. So it didn't matter if I called her George. It would not have mattered.
To have been a part of Carrie is one of the high points in my film career. To work with a great director like Brian De Palma, with some great actors, and to have it be a part of history. It really is a part of film history. It's a big kick for me.
I don't know that I could say that I knew that we were shooting a film that was going to be a classic and that people would be talking about forever and ever. I can say that when I saw the first dailies that I saw, I knew we were making a good movie.
I thought it was the coolest horror film I'd ever seen. It was like really this cool pop horror film. You know, everything before that I had seen was kind of like these just terrible B flicks, you know, with monsters and guys running around with hatchets and stuff. And this one was different. I think it really changed the thinking about horror.
Carrie is more than just a teenage horror film. It is about young kids trying to find, themselves as adults in the world. They're making that transition, and all the feelings of finding first love or wanting to be respected by your peers and not knowing quite where you fit in society, wanting to make a name for yourself.
There was a tremendous amount of emotional involvement and truth about the young people that were involved in it, and the madness that engulfed them all.
This was Brian's first commercial movie. He'd done these avant-garde movies, and this was going to be it. I was too young to be thinking in terms of longevity. I didn't think I was going to live past 35 myself, so I'm happy to be here still talking about it.
It was just a joyful experience, and of course when I was nominated, that was really a shocker. It was amazing.
I remember people saying, oh, you won't get a nomination. So we didn't expect anything like that because people said it's never happened. The Academy would never nominate a role from a horror film. So we were all surprised. Brian was the perfect person to take Stephen King's story. And, there was something very modern and very hip about Carrie, and it stands up.
I had no idea that this was going to be thought of as a classical movie years later. I knew I'd worked very hard on it. I knew it had an incredibly sophisticated visual design. And I knew the performances were really good. And it was a really great idea of a book from Stephen King. I really fought to direct Carrie. A friend of mine, a writer, told me about the book. I remember going around to a bookstore on 8th Street and buying the hardback, which hadn't sold too many copies, and reading it and saying, wow, I could really make a really terrific movie out of this. And then, calling my agent and trying to figure out where it was and who owned it. And I think it was before it moved to UA. It was over at some other studio. And I finally got turned around over to UA, and I got the job. As I remember, the screenplay was in pretty good shape in terms of, the way the book was laid out, and the way the book was laid out was very good.
The process of adaptation was an interesting one. I'd say the first draft that I did was very faithful to the book and its intentions, and it attempted to find a frame that would mirror the book's frame. And I think the core of the Carrie story that happened was fantastic, but it was very, very brief. Consequently, I think for the book, Steve came up with the Rashomon-like idea of a white commission of what had happened in the town of Chamberlain, like the JFK conspiracy theory. And I thought that was all sort of fantastic material. And the first attempt at a screenplay was to see if we could hold on to an element of that. I think for a number of reasons, when Brian came in, we went leaner and meaner in terms of what would ultimately emerge on the screen.
We had to make things smaller. My first idea is, well, we can't destroy the town for economic reasons. Let's just destroy the high school. And it also said to me that high school is your adolescent world. You don't have to destroy the whole village. A lot of things came to me through the movie, like the end sequence. We never quite figured out until we got to an end. But for the most part, the story was pretty much there. It's very close to the Stephen King book. I just first had to sort of set it up in this world of adolescent failure and trauma.
There was a scene at the very beginning of the film which was shot and edited and eventually eliminated from the film. And the idea of that scene was to establish the point in Carrie's life when she started to realize that she had certain powers.
And the idea was that it started with Carrie as a young girl who sees a young lady of 16 or 17, a sort of Lolita creature next door, who is out sunbathing. And she comes upon her and asks her, what are those? And the young lady says, what are you talking about? And she says, your dirty pillows. It was the word that she had been taught by her mother as a euphemism for breasts. And her mother sees her talking to the girl next door, flips out and starts screaming at her. She runs home. And as this young woman and now her mother watch from the lot next door, Margaret is screaming at Carrie. Carrie is virtually being tortured by Margaret. And something happens that's amazing, which is a rain of stones comes from the sky.
This was designed to set up a scene later in the film in which large stones fall from the sky and crush the house However, there were two problems. The gravel that fell out of the sky onto the house at the beginning didn't look like gravel, it looked like rain, it looked like water. And the second problem was with the later scene, they constructed a miniature house over a pit with elevators to drop it into a hole in the ground.
We built a half-scale version and put it on a lot somewhere in the valley. And we built it weeks in advance. So it was sitting out there. We had to put a chain link fence around it to protect it. But it was so cute. It looked exactly like the other house, but it was half scale.
They were going to set it on fire and have it crushed with stones, but the conveyor belt that was supposed to drop the stones on the house jammed. They were running out of nighttime. Dawn was coming soon. And Brian said, just burn the house. So they burned it. They sank it into the ground, but there were no stones. Unfortunately, they had already shot the interior scenes where stones were seen coming through the ceiling and so forth, but somehow in the context of all the action, we get away with it. But the idea was this prologue was going to establish young girl Carrie, upset, gravel out of the sky, and then as a grown teenager, more upset, big boulders out of the sky. But that whole idea had to be lost from the film.
I had months and months to prepare this movie, waiting to get the money to make the movie, wrestling over the budget. So I was sitting in my apartment and I had all these billboards up and I started to draw my little cards, and I literally had the whole movie, every shot, on a card, on the wall, around me. And I sat there for months moving them around and working out the whole visual design of the movie.
I'd lived in Philadelphia, gone to art school in Philadelphia, and I lived in a small 3-room house. It was one room on top of the other. And they used to refer to those in Philadelphia as Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And I started thinking, boy, well, perfect for this movie, because the mother was kind of a religious fanatic, and her house was patterned after a Father, Son, and Holy Ghost house in Philadelphia. And that's pretty much, what we started to build. But then we had to find an exterior. And although I talked about Father, Son, and Holy Ghost being 3 stories, this, of course, was on 2 stories. And I drove all over Los Angeles looking for an exterior for this house that was easy to read, that was unusual or weird in some way, that would fit with the story. I think I got out around Santa Paula, and I was driving down the street, and I saw this one house that had a vacant lot next door. And it was just bizarre. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. The more I looked at it, it was like asymmetrical. Things didn't line up. And I fell in love with it instantly and was excited because that meant I could stop driving. Once we found that house, we needed to design the interior to work with the exterior.
We basically tried to make it feel like it was just infused with religious fever, very claustrophobic and rigid.
We made a conscious effort to make it sort of Gothic church.
We used candles, we had, crosses and arches.
I went all over LA to the Spanish areas where they have a lot of religious shops looking for interesting artifacts to put in the house. The Last Supper rug was one of those gaudy Mexican rugs of the Last Supper, and it somehow seemed to work.
And of course, then we had the horrible closet she gets locked in with Saint Sebastian with God knows how many arrows in him. So she's just literally this very repressive religious vice that ultimately she breaks out of, which of course consists of revolting against her mother.
Brian has always been interested in film technique. He liked the idea of juxtaposing images from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen, juxtaposing a close-up image with a distant image in the same shot. So he used what is known as a split diopter lens, in which you can focus on something close on one side and focus on something distant on the other side. And the effect is you have, in a way, a built-in split screen. Brian is able to take people in different spaces and sort of brings them together into the image on the film.
I can't really think of any movie that I conceptualized so strongly visually and had so much time to play with the visual design of it before I shot it. And I literally lived with it for months and months and months. And things like the whole use of split screen and split diopter and slow motion and all this stuff was sort of worked out like a musical score. That's why I think it has that sort of very carefully designed look.
But we shot at least 3 schools. We shot some of the exteriors, the volleyball and locker room stuff at the Palisades High. We couldn't do the fire in a real school, although we did part of an exterior looking at a school burning in a school down, I believe, in Hermosa Beach. And then we shot in the soundstage at Culver City Studios. We built a gymnasium, which I was excited because I'd never built a set quite that big. The high school in Cary was named Bates High School in homage to Norman Bates. We were trying to find a logo for the school that somehow looked menacing. And I think that's why we came up with the stingers, the wasps. You know, we didn't want anything cuddly or too friendly or that could ever be interpreted as somehow lovable. And so we went with insect.
I feel in suspense movies or horror movies, you have to relieve tension in the audience. I mean, these are very souped up, gothic, stylized conceptions that unless you give the audience something to laugh at occasionally, they're going to start laughing at the whole movie.
One of my assistants on these early films was Bill Paxton, who's now an actor. But at the time, he was great in the art department, and he was one of the few people that would stay up all night and work on stuff with me. And Bill, his hobby was making 8mm films and exploring downtown Los Angeles. We were looking for interesting locations for the film. I'd always call Bill and say, you know, what have you got? And he told me about Farmer John's, which is a meat processing plant in downtown LA.
All those pigs that John is supposedly clobbering over the head, I think they served for dinner that night to us. I mean, because we shot all night there.
When we began filming, Brian started with one director of photography who did most of the filming at the school, the gym, and so forth. He was eventually replaced, and the subsequent filming involved the Carrie White house, their home and the interiors and so forth. That cameraman was a man named Mario Tosi. The scene at dinner where they fight about whether or not Carrie's going to go to the prom is an example of the kind of operatic style that Mario Tosi brought to the film. His notion of these extreme conditions of lighting and angles and so forth helped to serve the kind of grotesqueness of the story and the extremes of emotion and character and situation, the thunder and lightning flashing and darkness alternating with the white light of the lightning. It's part of the, an operatic approach to realizing a moment like that. Any good filmmaker employs contrast to achieve effects, so that if you're planning to build towards a moment in which there's going to be a lot of fast cutting, that fast cutting can be set up by a sequence where there is no cutting at all.
You want to show the whole world. This is the world that's going to be destroyed, so you take the sort of God's view of this world, and you come down, and then you introduce all your principals who are, coming in for the final drama here, basically. But I remember that huge crane parked over on the side of the soundstage, and we did a couple of very complicated crane shots.
Designing the set for the prom, the basic problem I had as an art director was to fill a large space. Because of our budget, we had no ceiling on the set. It was just too large. So we let the ceiling go dark. But to distract you from the fact that there was nothing there, we wanted to put something in the foreground to take your mind off it. And that's how we got the idea of the stars. And crepe paper seemed a given. I never thought about it before because I missed my senior prom. But after Carrie, it seemed like every time I saw a prom, there were stars hanging from the ceiling. We built the prom set with 360 degrees worth of walls. But we took away about 30% of those walls on one side that we could get a crane in for Brian. There were scenes where, as the dolly went by, people would be walking tables in behind it and putting them back. So it was kind of a liquid set, and it would be changing and going. The shots were complex, but Brian had storyboarded them so completely that everyone knew kind of what would be seen. The advantage we had is that it was a kind of repetitive set, that the left side looked like the right side, so that you could pretty much shoot in one direction and just change the people around or turn things over, and it would look like you were in a different part of the gymnasium.
This is a very important emotional scene between Tommy and Carrie. And I wanted to set up this wild sort of celestial environment they're in by dropping the camera low, so you see all the stars that are all those phony stars that are at the prom whirring faster around.
twirling the camera, which is, symbolic of kind of her intoxication with the happiness of the moment.
But this was a combination of us running around them and also putting them on a turntable. I don't know how we got over the vertigo of doing this shot.
This is a very involved and lengthy piece of storytelling that involves only images. And this is all one long take with no cutting.
We called it the figure 8 shot. The figure 8 shot was one of those shots that took a day to shoot, and the studio got very upset with me. They couldn't figure out what I was doing. It was, one of these days where I spent all day rehearsing a shot and then started to shoot it like at 4 or 5 or 6 o'clock, and everybody thought I was insane. They didn't have an idea what I was doing. In fact, at one point, the head of the studio came down to the set, and we had a big argument about it. And I said, what do you want me to do, shoot a bunch of close-ups here? Will that make you happy? It's not going to work. We need this elaborate shot, and fire me, basically. That was my attitude. And it just took forever. One of the guys on the crane kept not hitting his mark. When we went up, we would go too far in or too far out. And this, I don't know, we were like 35, it was way up there trying to get this shot. In terms of all the POVs, that was very carefully worked out. Everybody's seeing something from a different point of view and interpreting information because they're in a different position.
Brian wanted to demonstrate that the Amy Irving character understood that the bucket of blood was directly over the winner's podium. So in order to do that, he had a piece of crepe paper fall from the bucket, and the camera followed it down.
Everybody seeing things from different points of view and not exactly sure what's going on. And when they realize what's going on, then they all do the wrong thing, basically. And then the whole world falls apart.
The pig's blood was actually Caro syrup in food coloring. And the great thing about Caro syrup was it didn't smell, or it was sweet. I mean, you wouldn't want to use real blood.
At one point, the producer came to me because the head of the studio was very upset about this pig's blood on top of her, and the producer said to me, could we change it to something else? And I said, what are we going to use, blue paint? I don't think it'll have exactly the same effect. How about confetti?
The sound for a moment of shock when the blood is dumped seemed to require a moment of silence. And there's this horrible moment where everyone realizes what's happened. And the sound at that point is very stylized. We chose only certain elements to hear so that you felt the extreme discomfort and horror of the moment, what it meant to Carrie. And the first sound that starts to creep in is the sound of the laughter as she realizes that her worst nightmare has come true more than she ever could have possibly imagined.
One of the questions that's come up over the years was, is Miss Collins laughing at Carrie in the scene? And the answer is no, not at all. A good deal of that sequence is really in Carrie's mind, which tips over at the point of the blood. What is occurring is a mixture of what her mother has threatened and promised will indeed happen, her worst fears, her imagination, her paranoia, and everything else.
When she reacts in a rage at this humiliation, and she starts to use her powers, and then this is the point at which Brian introduced the split screen, and that gave rise to a new set of editorial problems.
That I felt ultimately was a great mistake. Split screen is not good for action. It just becomes gimmicky with action and doesn't have enough visceral energy for action sequences. It removes you too much. So I shot the whole sequence in split screen, and then when we got in the editing room, Paul and I just kept on pulling the split screen out more and more because this is more about, this is vengeance, and it's very direct and works better with very dramatic cuts rather than these sort of meditative split screens you have to follow and try to watch two things happen simultaneously.
We ended up destroying everything because it was built, and it was fun to do. Depending on how much time you have in the day, you're like, well, let's attack these decorations or this table.
The decision to kill Miss Collins, I think, was an interesting and a brave and a shocking one, because I think it created a very strange reaction in the audience, which said, you're not safe here at all. In another movie, she would have been a survivor.
Rubber cement on anything will give you a beautiful flame. And everything burnt nicely. Sissy in that scene was probably not 12 feet from the flames. I mean, these were flames that were shooting 10 feet in the air, and it was very hot, and the syrup was getting warmer, but she was so determined to be in every scene.
This was a low-budget movie. I mean, ultimately cost $1.8 million. We were out there on that road up in the hills. Nancy was driving. You know, I'm right on the hood, and God knows if she's going to drive off the road.
Dick Zeiker was the stunt coordinator on the film. He'd built a cannon in the middle of this car, and in that cannon they put about a 2.5-foot sawed-off piece of a telephone pole with a charge on top of it. Now he's driving this car, and he has a switch on the steering wheel. When he pushes that switch, the charge will go off and shoot that telephone pole into the ground and flip the car over.
And I remember, you know, as dawn was coming up, you know, praying basically that Dick Zeiker was not going to get hurt. Please, God, let's not get anybody hurt on this movie. And finally, I remember the sun was like coming up. We had all the cameras set up. Dick Zeiker hit that thing. It rolled 6.5 times, came to a stop, and it was perfect, you know. So, wow.
By the time you get to the end of a Brian De Palma film, you can do almost anything. He's got the audience kind of like accepting his conventions. And we were able to put all those candles in the house because people were so involved with the story. And I don't think that, at least on first watch, people were going, wow, 700 candles, how did she light them? Where did she get them? Where did she get the money to get them? But I actually think she was saving them. That every time she went to church, she would steal a little candle.
The notion of Margaret's death was one of the main changes between the novel and the movie. Brian felt strongly, and I think accurately, that the method in which she died in the book, with Carrie stopping her heart a little bit at a time, was fantastic for the book and a really good concept. But in transferring it to the film, it really didn't have any visceral punch or work at all. I was out to dinner one night with Marty Scorsese at Musso and Frank's in Hollywood, and Brian came in, stopped at the table, and said, I have a great idea about Margaret's death. All the kitchen instruments are going to impale her. And I looked at him and thought he'd lost his mind completely at that moment. He went on to explain that the source for this idea was Kurosawa, and the more I thought about the idea at that point, the more it made sense.
Always when you're making horror films or suspense movies, and very conservative people financing these movies, you're always fighting the fact that, well, can't you do it so it's not so upsetting or not so, shall we say, in bad taste? And I'm constantly knowing what's going to work on film and what's not going to work, and trying to come up with some kind of very strong image. And I got this sort of crucifixion image of the mother. And everybody was going, oh my God, this is just in the worst taste, you know, and I just went ahead and did it. It sort of fell in line with using blood instead of confetti. It's supposed to be horrible. You're supposed to come up with the most terrifying image that you can, and that's what I did.
The utensils leaping into the air, that was pretty simple. It was achieved by attaching a monofilament to the end of the implement, whatever it was, just at the edge of frame, and on cue somebody would just yank it and the knife or whatever it was would appear to leap out of frame. Then the next element was to get the object flying through the air, and again what the special effects people did was to rig a monofilament which was not visible to the camera, and they would slide the object along this through frame so that they didn't have to throw it accurately.
I said, well, since we're going to crucify her mother, let's set up where she got this idea. So Jack created this, St. Sebastian with all these arrows in it.
And I think that I remade it a little bit and added some more arrows and sort of placed them so it'd be similar to the way the mother died in the end.
So that was an idea that Carrie got from the abuse she got from her mother and ultimately wreaked vengeance upon her.
The ending of the movie is probably the most notorious change from the book. The book ended very much with the notion of the frame was restored. You were brought back to reality of did this happen or didn't it happen. It was covered up by the commission that there was no such thing as telekinesis. And then Steve, as a sort of kicker, last little punch, did a ... off in another city in another part of the country. There's a little girl moving marbles ... And it was fine in terms of the book. In terms of writing the screenplay, I had a couple of shots of different endings that would retain the notion of a twist, and just when you thought it was safe would still leave you with something. At one point again, Brian came in having had one of these epiphanies and said, I've got a great idea for the ending of this. And it was something that Stephen King adored in the picture and wished he'd thought of it. So we got his blessing in terms of it.
The idea for the end of Carrie was inspired by the end of Deliverance, which Brian and I saw together. At the end of the film, a hand comes up out of the river.
Deliverance is a great movie, and that last image of, you never can forget, and that hand comes out of the water. So that always stuck in my mind. I never realized how successful it was going to be.
I think music and thrillers or horror movies are indivisible. They can't work without each other. Brian had the extraordinary good luck and opportunity to work with Bernard Herrmann on several movies. The whole notion of why Hitchcock films worked, I think, was due in no small measure to his scores, Bernard Herrmann being an extraordinary example of what music and image together could create. When Bernard Herrmann passed away, Brian was lucky enough, in our case, to find Pino Donaggio. And what Donaggio brought to this was everything from being able to capture the dreamlikeness of the experience, the lullabies, the caressing of an audience to take them on a particular path that we wanted them to go on, to specific homages to Herrmann in the shower scene, obviously from Psycho.
I really liked the story, but I liked the film better. I liked it because I was working on it and because it was so much fun. Because Brian was so receptive to any ideas. You couldn't go too far with Brian. You could really experiment and try things, and it was fun.
Well, Carrie was a real breakthrough for Brian. It was the first of his pictures that really had great commercial success. This was the first time that he really connected with an audience, and I think it gave him entree to projects in Hollywood that he might not have had a chance with before this. And it was an exciting film to work on because there were so many young people who made an impact for the first time in that film.
Watching the film being made, what was clear to me was that the performances were extraordinary and that they would live irrespective of anything else about the movie. Whether we managed to suspend disbelief and scare the hell out of you in terms of the course of it, I felt we would do that without question. But no, I don't think any of us had the idea that 25 years from now we'd be sitting here having this conversation.
I'm surrounded by contemporaries that were George Lucas and Spielberg and Scorsese that were having these tremendous successes in the same period. And I always thought of myself as I was lucky to have this, little horror film that's sort of done well so I can go on and make another one.